So today I'm going to be talking about some literary theory and film analysis, which is slightly different than what I might normally talk about on my YouTube channel. So I wanted to take a quick moment just to talk about, what is actually going to be in this video, so you can decide if you have any interest in watching it, which I imagine most people won't, and that's totally fine. But I'm going to start off with this idea of the maze versus the labyrinth as two distinct structures. I just want to sort of explain the differences for those who might not know. I'll sort of leave it on the table in the back of your mind, and I'm going to dive into some literary theory from one of my favorite literary theorists of all time and favorite writers of all time, Alain Robbe-Grillet, who is a very sort of iconoclastic and slightly controversial author in France in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and specifically his idea of the new novel, which is a pretty radical approach to fiction. And then I'm going to use those ideas in conjunction with some film analysis techniques to sort of talk about two really important films to me, which are Angel's Egg and Stalker, two of the coolest works of film ever. And I sort of just want to analyze how they relate to Robbe-Grillet's theories and ideas, and why these works are considered so confusing to so many people. After everything's sort of on the table, I'll circle back to this idea of the labyrinth and the maze, and hopefully by the end of the video, these images down here will be more than just things you can solve or draw a line through, and can actually become pretty poignant metaphors for two different schools of how we can approach art and literature. So what is the difference between a maze and a labyrinth? Well, a maze is a structure that has turns and branching paths and dead ends that are ultimately designed to trick you and make you get lost. So at every point in a maze, you have to be spatially oriented, you have to know where you're going, you have to have a sense of logic and navigability, you need to make decisions, right? And if you make enough of the right decisions, you end up solving the maze, you make it out to the other side. Now, on the complete contrary, the labyrinth is a structure which by definition only has a single continuous pathway all the way to the center. And if you want to escape, you have to retrace your steps again all the way back to the start. Now, because it's only one continuous pathway, you actually can't get lost in a labyrinth, and in fact, it's not designed to trick you or beguile you in any sense. A labyrinth is sort of meant to guide you. It's meant to be more of a meditative and reflective experience because, again, you can't get lost in a labyrinth. There are no choices to make. And so this is why historically, in cultures that actually built labyrinths and mazes, the labyrinth is more of a spiritual structure, whereas the maze is more of an intellectual structure. So I'll just sort of leave that on the table because you're probably wondering, or you may have a clue of how this can relate to interpreting art and literature and whatnot. But I'll just use this as a springboard to talk about some of my favorite writers and filmmakers of all time. So going from left to right here, we have Alain Robbe-Grillet's For a New Novel, which is a series of essays that he writes on fiction, where he introduces this idea of the nouveau roman, and he's sort of the father of this movement of the new novel, even though he doesn't really like that term. But he is the father, and it is really a radical way of consuming and creating literature that is intended to be very iconoclastic, that is intended to tear down the status quo of the present form of the novel. So I'll get into more what that actually looks like in a bit, but I want to take some of these ideas of his, specifically his ideas that art isn't always meant to be interpreted, and I want to transpose those onto two works of art that I think many people historically try to interpret. Those being the film that needs no introduction, Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, probably the single most famous piece of science fiction media maybe ever, and Angel's Egg, which is kind of a cult classic but gaining a lot of popularity because it is a really cool 4K restoration that just came out. So if you haven't seen that, I think it actually might be on HBO Max. Definitely go watch it. These are two of the greatest films of all time, in my opinion. So I'll just make a quick detour here to talk about analysis versus interpretation. I really want to take a moment to clarify that I will not be doing much interpretation at all in this video, because interpretation is more pedagogical. It's the process of trying to explain or tell the meaning of, as the definition says here, so to basically decipher various metaphors and symbols that we see in artwork. Whereas analysis is more of a passive act. It's simply studying the media objects and trying to pick out what are the essential and defining features of that piece of artwork. So this is much more in line with the purpose of this video. It's just to point out things that are, really interesting to you. And if you decide to go watch these films or read this book, then you'll have a little bit, a couple more tools in your arsenal, so to speak. The person who's really actually against interpretation is Susan Sontag, who wrote an entire book called Against Interpretation. And she says interpretation is the revenge of the intellect upon art. It impoverishes, it depletes the world, and sets up a shadow world of meanings. Quite a severe quote from one of the coolest writers ever, but we'll circle back to this in the context of Angel's Egg. So let's talk about the new novel. The new novel is unlike what you might suspect, it's not really a well-defined movement of writers. It doesn't even really have a specific time period. He's very insouciant about it. He doesn't really care. He says it's a convenient label, right? It just describes people who are seeking new forms for the novel. So in many ways, even though he doesn't like this term, this really just represents the avant-garde, right? The new novel, this idea that we should always be pushing literature to new boundaries, is just the avant-garde. So the new novel movement exists today. It's going to exist for the rest of time. It's just his way of describing that. Now, the new novel, or what he's aspiring to, kind of implies something that he's trying to move away from. And I would call this the old novel. He doesn't really use that term, but he does describe it, right? He says, in the 19th century, the predominant form of the book or of literature is all about treating the artist or the author like someone who has all the answers, right? That when you pick up a book, the author has embedded all of these messages for you to decipher or to pick apart or interpret. So it's all about interpretation and symbolism. And more so than that, it's actually about a specific type of interpretation, which is psychological analysis. So this is really what he says is the basis of the 19th century novel and early 20th century novel, specifically in France, but really everywhere. I would argue this is still kind of the predominant form of the novel, which is that you have novels that revolve around a certain character, right? A certain character or troupe of characters. And the whole point of the novel is to explain the inner workings of those characters, to explain what goes on inside their mind, what makes them tick, and why they do the things they do. So Crime and Punishment would be a great example of that. You read it because you want to get access to Raskolnikov's interior psyche and figure out why he kills that old lady. So now let's talk about Angel's Egg, which I think is kind of a really good example of something that has a lot of traits of the new novel movement. So it takes place in a strange city. You have this little girl here who carries around this egg with her. And this egg, we don't know what's inside of it. We don't know where it's from, but she treats it like it's the most important thing in the world. And one day she runs into this boy who apparently is searching for a bird he saw in a dream. So he's kind of weird, but he kind of just follows her around and asks a bunch of questions. In fact, the first question that is asked in the film, that's actually asked by both characters really, is who are you? And this is the quintessential question of psychoanalysis, right? Psychoanalysis, as a form of literature, wonders who the characters are. Who are you, right? What makes you operate? What makes you tick? Where do you come from? And why do you do the things that you do? And you can see that he has this really harsh binauristic black and white lighting on his face that kind of implies there is an answer, right? You either have the answer or you don't. This is probably the one line in the film, the one line of dialogue in the film that is completely easy to understand, and he just completely elucidates his philosophy, which is that if you want, you have to break an egg if you want to know what's inside, right? That's his quote. So, crazy foreshadowing moment. You're never going to guess what this guy does in like 50 minutes, into the movie. But this is the modus operandi of the psychoanalytical tradition. It's all about breaking things open in order to understand them. Now, Robbe-Grillet wants to move away from this, and he wants to, again, move towards this idea of the new novel. Now, for him, the new novel is, it's not significant, and it's also not absurd. So what does he mean by that? Significance, again, refers to that psychoanalytical tradition where everything is significant, everything has a hidden meaning. If a character does something, it's indicative of their interior psychological state, right? So obviously, Alain Robbe-Grillet says, yeah, not true. Not what I want the novel to be. And he also references something that is slightly newer, which is the absurdist philosophy, mostly deriving from Albert Camus, which is, to grossly oversimplify, you could say that the absurdist philosophy says that nothing has a meaning. Again, very, very gross oversimplification. But he says that neither of these schools of thought, which are kind of dominant at the time, are what the novel should be, because both of them are still concerned with meaning. Even though both of them, one of them says everything has meaning and the other one says nothing has meaning, both of them give primacy to this idea of meaning. They both concern themselves with meaning as the ultimate question of artwork and human experience. So he wants us to imagine a novel or a work of fiction that is somehow beyond the confines or beyond the concept of meaning. So we're going to talk about what that looks like, right? He says that what we should really be focusing on, instead of signification and meaning and sort of enclosing things in a system of constant references, is to focus on the presence, is the word he uses, the presence that objects have. What does that actually look like? Well, if we look at some of the stills from Angel's Egg, right, most of the film is spent with stills like this. It's actually not spent trying to answer questions like who are you or what's inside the egg. Most of the film is spent looking at very small details and objects around the world. So for example, the way that this sort of blue glint of moonlight alights on top of this, weird shadowy lake in the forest. The way that this stream of water creates these effervescent bubbles as it fills up this jar of water that she collects. The way that you can have the slight ripples on the surface of a body of water that are distorting this sort of gloomy reflection of these lanky tree boughs. These small details have absolutely no relevance to the plot whatsoever. They do not move the story forward whatsoever. But this is what most of the film is like. It's spent with these small moments of observation. And Robbe-Grillet says that this is sort of artistry in its pure form, where you don't worry about what things mean, but you just worry about what they look like and what they are. And in fact, the only moment in the film I was able to identify where the character actually has the slightest suggestion of a smile or happiness on her face is where she's sitting by the water and just watching how beautiful it is to see it reflect on her face. And you're never going to guess what's making her so sad in this frame. This is when she runs into the man for the first time. And again, he's just bombarding her with questions, right? So again, this film kind of shows us that there's something more sublime and joyful when we simply absorb the beauty of the world rather than constantly questioning its meaning and searching for answers and truth. So Robbe-Grillet says in order to escape the old novel and to reach something more like this mode of storytelling, we have to abandon things like character. And so he says, the traditional concept of a character, and certainly this is how it's taught in, for example, English class, is that characters have, a proper name, which implies they have, a last name, parents, heredity, professions, they earn money to buy things that, define them. They have a face which is molded by their past. And because they have a well-defined character, we can predict how they are going to act and how they're going to respond to various stimuli, right? Everything about them kind of makes sense within the context of their character. Now he says, that around the time of writing these essays, there are actually some pretty interesting people who are sort of going against that traditional notion of character. And he references two of his friends here, being Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, who write what are now considered completely canonical works in existential fiction, Nausea and The Stranger. Now he says, the protagonists of Nausea and The Stranger, being Roquentine and Meursault, they're not really characters in the traditional sense. Like, yes, they are characters on paper, but they lack pretty much everything that has up until that point defined what a character is. And lo and behold, Angel's Egg is actually doing pretty much the same thing. So the characters here have a discussion on their past and where they come from. And both of them have no clue. Both of them have no clue about the history of the world or where they come from or who they really are. And again, he says this is one of the ways in which we can really dismantle the form or the dominant form of the old novel. And so he says the old novel is really based around, again, this idea of a coherent universe, right? Where everything makes sense. Everything is stable and decipherable. You can understand the characters, the setting, the symbolism. I would say Angel's Egg is pretty radical and, again, such a perfect example of the Nouveau Roman because its universe is incoherent. So I have here 3 images from the film. And what you'll notice is that they kind of look like they could all be from 3 different films, right? And none of the symbolism, or none of the imagery, I should say, feels coherent within itself. So you have these checkerboards here, but then you have sort of this cyber-sigillus bramble off to the side, these clouds with this mechanical but also very divine-looking eyeball in the sky. At the same time, you have a tree here which is inscribed with what looks like modern circuitry. But in contrast to that modernity, you have this old cobblestone road, which looks like it's hundreds and hundreds of years old, but it's being driven over by, again, what looks like kind of a futuristic steampunk vehicle, if you can even call this a vehicle, right? And so what I'm trying to get at here is the film refuses a coherent aesthetic. And in my mind, this is as close as Mamoru Oshii can get to telling us that we're not really supposed to understand this film, because nothing here is intelligible, nothing here is explained, and it's all incoherent. And that's kind of the point, right? You have to be okay with incoherence, at least in the context of the new novel or experimental fiction. That being said, people are still very obsessed with symbolism. They always will be obsessed with symbolism. That's just how English and literature and semiotics are taught in school. So people love to dive into what does the egg represent? What does this cross represent? People think that there's some sort of messianic allusion here because of all the biblical allusion, and this guy looks like maybe he's Jesus carrying the cross. Maybe this is some form of the Virgin Mary, all these sort of interpretations, right? I'm not going to say that you can't do that. Obviously, you're free to interpret art at your will. But what I will say is there's a moment in the film where I really feel like, again, it's telling us not to try and interpret everything. So this is probably one of the most famous moments in the film, where you have a bunch of these fishermen who go out into the city every so often, and they're obsessed. They are completely obsessed. It's the only thing they do with harpooning these fish that are these shadowy fish that are flowing through the city. And obviously the fish are just shadows, and they're not real fish. So when they try to harpoon them, they can't catch anything. They can't actually grasp anything. So their harpoons end up just, impaling the facade of the windows and shattering the glass. And the girl remarks, she's saying, there are no fish. They're chasing after nothing, right? And again, I feel like this is very similar to ideas of interpretation, right? Um, they are trying to grasp at something that might not actually be there, that the film might intentionally be withholding from us. Um, and again, we can go back to this Susan Sontag quote where she says, when you try to interpret something, you deplete it, you remove the actual form of it, and you're left with just the shadow of it, right? The meaning of something is really just its shadow. And this is exactly what we can kind of see going on here, right? They don't actually have the fish, right? And this is sort of the image of someone who's trying to grasp at something that is no longer there, because they're so focused on what it might mean that they actually lost sight of the original object, itself. So we arrive at the most interesting part of the film here, where, unsurprisingly, the man becomes too curious about what the egg is and what it might symbolize, and how he can interpret it, that he shatters it. He shatters it open to try to get a look inside of it, to figure out what the egg is. And I want you to guess: does he obtain that ultimate clarity? Do we get an answer about what the egg is and what it symbolizes? Of course not. What we're instead left with is the symbol of agony, right? And not only agony, but more confusion. So this is the one of the most cryptic images in the entire film, where after the egg is shattered, there's like 5 dozen more eggs that rise up out of the water out of nowhere. And so, my interpretation of this, I know I said I wouldn't interpret, but this is just, I have to indulge once. When we try to obtain meaning by brute force, by just strong-arming our way to understanding a piece of artwork, it kind of only just multiplies the confusion that is there. And sometimes we have to be okay with artwork that doesn't necessarily have a direct interpretation. So I'm going to leave this here for now, and I'm going to transition to talking about Stalker, and then I'll tie both films together at the end. So Stalker is actually a really similar film for many reasons. Again, we start in a very mysterious and kind of suffocating city. This time we have 3 characters. We have a stalker here, who is a guide that takes his 2 clients into a zone. Now, the zone is rumored to have a room that, if you enter the room, it will give you your greatest desire, right? Sort of like, the One Wish Willow from Obsession. So the zone obviously is a sort of metaphysical place where the laws of physics don't really seem to operate, but these 2 characters, one of which is the writer, the other of which is the professor, venture into the zone in search of this room, guided by the stalker. Now, what I really want to argue is that the journey these characters take into from the city into the zone is motivated actually by many of the same factors that motivates Alain Robbe-Grillet to transition from the status quo, the old novel, into the new novel. And that might seem like kind of a big stretch for now, but I want to raise a couple parallels that I think will actually be pretty convincing in terms of how we can view these 2 pieces of art side by side. So, for example, at the start of the film, the stalker says to his wife that he's going into the zone, and she sort of laments, and she says, please don't, you're going to go to jail, because you're not really supposed to go into the zone. And he scoffs at that, and he says, jail? I'm already in jail, right? This city is jail. And in fact, when he arrives at the zone for the first time, not only does the film, switch to color, that's the famous moment, but the first thing he says in the zone is that he's home at last. So his home, he's kind of a shitty husband, but his home is not with his wife. It's in this chaotic and alien landscape known as the zone. And so what does that have to do with Alain Robbe-Grillet, right? Well, I want to return to this quote that I brought up earlier, where he's describing the sort of literary milieu or environment or status quo at the time, where everyone is sort of writing psychoanalytic novels, everyone's kind of writing the same thing over and over, and everything references each other, everything has a hidden meaning, and Robbe-Grillet says that he feels, quote-unquote, enclosed in a system of references. That is remarkably similar language to this idea of jail, right, of starting out in something that is suffocating and confining you. And so by extension, we would say that, much like the stalker wants to go towards the zone to reach that idea of freedom or liberation or lawlessness that he can't find at home, Robbe-Grillet wants to invent the new novel for many of the similar reasons, right? He wants to invent an art form that is not bounded by the rules and conventions of previous iterations of the novel. So down here, I have a quote from Brian Eno. This is his sort of ethos on making music, but he's really just an artist in general. And he says that when we create things, we should be gardening, not doing architecture. And now, what does that mean? Well, if you look at, again, this image from the city at the start of the film contrasted with some of the first images we see of the zone, you'll see that this looks a lot like architecture, right? There are these imposing brutalist structures. There's a sense of design and congruity, precision and control. These railroad tracks tell you where you can go. The barricades and soldiers tell you when you can go there. And architecture implies an architect, and again, that's the idea of this supreme genius, author who designs the world for you to inhabit and interpret. Now, contrary to that, we have this idea of gardening, and of course, the zone looks more like a forest than a city, right? It's completely overgrown. Now, in gardening, you don't build structures; you plant seeds, and once you plant the seeds, they're out of your control. So there's something stochastic and chaotic about gardening in the sense that you don't really have full authority and control over what your garden is going to do, right? And so in some senses, we can say that a garden is something that you more so experience, and architecture is something that you more so interpret or design, right? And so again, these are two different approaches, not only to art in general, but they represent the city and the zone in the Stalker, and they also represent in many ways exactly what Alain Robbe-Grillet is talking about when he talks about transitioning from the old novel, which is full of formulaic things and laws and design, to the new novel, which is radical and chaotic and dangerous in many ways. So now we can start talking about why the characters go in the zone. This is probably the core of the film. Why do the characters go into there? And let's start with the character of the writer. Much like Meursault, Roquentine, or the characters of Angel's Egg, he's kind of like an anti-character in the sense that he has no history, he has really no characterization, and he's sort of this abstract idea of, again, the writer. And so he says that he goes into the zone for inspiration. He says he's lost his inspiration, and he wants to go into the zone to basically rejuvenate his creative spark. Now, this is, again, exactly why Alain Robbe-Grillet wants to invent the new novel, because he feels like intellectual culture has sort of stagnated. And again, people are writing very, very similar things, and they're not being radical enough with their structure. They are uninspired, right? And so we can see that Robbe-Grillet's motivations for offering this theory of, the new novel is identical to the writer's character in Stalker and his reasons for why he wants to go into the zone. And they both want a freedom from form, I guess you could say. So here are even more parallels between Robbe-Grillet's theory and Stalker. The second they land in the zone, the writer and the professor, as their names suggest, immediately launch into a very philosophical discussion. So they're talking about metaphor and symbolism and history. And he says, I have a quote here specifically. I froze it on this part where he says, "Are you speaking figuratively?" Right? In other words, what is the representation of what you're saying? Now, all of a sudden, in the middle of this very dense, abstract conversation, the zone emits this rancorous, alien noise that completely startles them, and it just obliterates this abstract conversation they have and draws their attention and their gaze deeper into the zone. And instead of asking, what does it represent? What symbols are you talking about? They ask, what is that noise, right? What is that object? And again, this is exactly what Alain Robbe-Grillet compels us to do with the new novel. He says, let's stop talking about metaphor and references, and let's just talk about what is solid and immediate and actually in front of us, right? Let's focus on the objects in the world around us. So big parallels between these two things here. Now, for a lot of people, I think, rightfully so, it can be very hard to imagine art that doesn't have meaning, right? Because in school, we're taught that, art has meaning for us to interpret. In Stalker, there is a character who goes on a monologue about music. And he says music is without ideas and without association. But nevertheless, it is able to miraculously penetrate your soul and bring you a source of delight. Now, that's pretty contentious. I wouldn't go as far as to say that music is without ideas. There are definitely musical pieces and compositions out there that you could write very long essays and interpretations about. But if you imagine for a second that you're walking along the street and you hear music playing from like a cafe, or your friend is just showing you a song for the first time, I would wager that before you start analyzing its rhythm and its structure and its lyricism, you probably just appraise the song as something beautiful and delightful. You are elated to hear this piece of music. And so music is kind of an example of the fact that it is possible to have something artistic that is beautiful before it is meaningful. And that's the whole point of the new novel, is that beauty should precede meaning. And so, Tarkovsky and Robbe-Grillet are kind of saying the same thing, which is that, if music can be beautiful before it is interpreted, why can't we do the same thing with film and literature, right? And that's what the new novel is. So at the climax of the film, they get to the very edge of the room, and they are, on the precipice of being able to get whatever they want, or so they think. This is when they learn that the room doesn't really grant you, your wish in the sense that a one-wish willow would, but rather it looks inside of you to look at, your truest nature, and it grants you something that would complement your truest nature. So they tell the story of this man named Porcupine, who once made his way all the way through the zone and into the room. And once he got into the room, he got onto his knees and he begged for his brother back. But what did the room give him? It gave him a pile of money. right? And the reason that is because the room, as it functions in Stalker, sort of looks deep inside of you, and it analyzed or interpreted the character of Porcupine, and it understood that his truest essence was greed, not of a loving brother, right? And so they realized that the room kind of represents that psychoanalytic tradition of breaking something open to understand the absolute truth inside of it, right? And again, this is exactly what Robbe-Grillet says we should not be doing with art. He says the function of art is never to illustrate a truth, and that is the exact word they use here, his true essence or his true nature. So what do these characters, what does the writer and the professor do in light of this revelation? They decide not to go into the room at all, right? And this is the big moment in the film where they refuse this notion of absolute truth. When they realize that the room is something that looks inside of you, it analyzes you, and it spits out this truth about who you are that you might not know yourself, they refuse that. They refuse the notion of absolute truth. And so here, this is sort of wrapping up my analysis of Stalker, and we can go back to this image as promised of the labyrinth and the maze. So hopefully the metaphor is slightly more clear now, but I'll spell it out for you. We are extraordinarily good at creating art that is maze-like, and we're very good at looking at art and assuming that it's a maze. Finishing a movie like Stalker or Angel's Egg, I would wager that many of us, including myself when I first watched these films, I went onto YouTube or onto various literary websites and blogs, and I looked up what people thought about this film. I looked up analysis videos, interpretations, semiotic essays, because I wanted to understand these works through and through. In some senses, like a maze, I wanted to go in one end and then out the other and feel like I had conquered it, right? But Robbe-Grillet says that instead of assuming that every difficult work is hiding a solution for us to uncover, instead of assuming that we can solve artwork, we should instead imagine some of these things more like labyrinths, right? Labyrinths, again, are places that you enter and then exit the same way you came in. It's about experience and reflection, and it's not about solving or logic. It's about having a spiritual, sort of transcendental experience with the structure itself. And within the structure of a labyrinth, as I said at the start of the video, it is impossible to get lost, and it is impossible to be confused, because those concepts of confusion and being lost presuppose that there's a right way to go. In a labyrinth, there's only one path to go, right? There are no right turns and wrong turns. There's only the guided experience. So again, this is sort of the metaphor that I would compel us to think about when approaching experimental artwork, is that oftentimes it is a lot more beneficial to simply experience it in the way that we would experience a labyrinth, rather than trying to solve it or decipher it in the way that we would a maze. And so I'll end with this idea of rain. Now, after the characters of Stalker refuse to go into the room, the room mysteriously floods with rain. And again, this is an inside area, it's not outside, but rain seems to fall very mysteriously. Similarly, and very peculiarly, after the boy or the man in Angel's Egg shatters the egg, the city begins to rain, and it floods with rain, almost a biblical amount of rain. And so why does this happen, right? Rain in both of these films arrives at the precise moment where absolute truth is revealed to be a sham, right? Whereas he tried to shatter the egg, and he found no sense of absolute truth, they reached the room and decided not even to that they didn't believe in the idea of absolute truth, right? That they saw no value in it. So in some senses, we can return to this quote here of the significant and the absurd. Angel's Egg is sort of the absurd, right? It is absurd to carry around an egg that has no meaning, and to safeguard it at all times. That is absurd. And at the same time, the room, which is able to look inside of you and tell you something about yourself that you might not know, for example, that you value money over your dead brother, that is significant. That is psychoanalytical, right? That is interpreting your character. So if these films were a maze, we would be pretty frustrated, because we would be denied that sense of absolute truth. But if we instead see these works as more so labyrinths, we can understand that there's not meant to be any hidden revelation, right? Whether or not the characters seek absolute truth or they reject absolute truth, the world simply continues. What remains after the collapse of truth and revelation is not an answer, but just an experience, the beautiful experience of sitting in the rain. And to sit in the rain as it washes over you is just to see the world expressing itself, right? And in many ways, that is an alternate way and an alternate form of getting to the true experience of life. As Robbe-Grillet says, it's not significant, it's not absurd. It is, quite simply, the rain is. And I want to tie this into a beautiful, beautiful passage from Sculpting in Time by Andrei Tarkovsky, one of my favorite film theory books of all time. He says, "I declare that there are no symbols or metaphors in my films. People ask me again and again what rain signifies in my films. Why does it figure in film after film, and why the repeated images of wind, fire, and water? I really don't know how to deal with such questions. Rain is, after all, typical of the landscape in which I grew up. In Russia, you have those long, dreary, persistent rains, and I can say that I love nature. Rain, fire, water, snow, dew, the driving ground wind, all are part of the material setting in which we dwell, and I would even say the truth of our lives. So the fact that Tarkovsky, after spending a whole movie refusing the idea of truth, when writing about his films, he brings back the idea of truth. It's just not the same truth that you came looking for when the characters sought out to the room. The truth, in some senses, is in the rain. It is in rain and images that have no metaphorical meaning. And so, in the spirit of ambiguity, I'm just going to leave you guys with this insane quote here from Angel's Egg that really ties everything together. The boy has this banger quote, and he just randomly says, "Maybe no one really exists, and it is only raining outside." So again, because I don't want to interpret things for you, I'm just going to leave this here, and hopefully you can see there's a really cool sort of spider web that is connecting these ideas of rain and truth and the labyrinthine, or the maze-like, absolute truth and physical truth. So anyways, I hope this was probably kind of confusing and nonsensical, but I hope that some of these ideas were interesting to you, and the next time you're consuming a piece of artwork, just take a moment to consider whether or not you're in a maze or if you could be in a labyrinth. So if you made it this far, thanks for watching.